Hi, I'm Vanessa Lynch, and welcome to the DNA for Africa podcast series. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking to Pieter Cronje, a human rights lawyer and specialist in human trafficking, training and consulting. Pieter, welcome. Thank you for joining us. You know, many people I speak to think that human trafficking is an old world problem that doesn't really occur. But when I read in papers and when I read articles, I see that this is a form of human slavery, and it's happening right now in our modern world. Can you describe a little bit more about what it encompasses? What does human trafficking mean, and how prevalent is it within our societies?
Well, basically, human trafficking is about one person exploiting another. It's also about labor exploitation, being exploited in factories, for example, men working in the Middle East and not getting paid or living in very bad conditions, children trafficked for sexual exploitation or even for purposes of adoption. Then you can get organ trafficking, where people are enticed or they are, they are forced to give their organs. You have such a variety of things. Children getting them to beg in streets, and that's quite prevalent in East Africa, especially. Domestic servitude, so getting girls, they think they're going to get a nice job in the Middle East, especially girls from East Africa, and then they just don't get paid, or they get beaten, they get robbed, they get raped. Their passports are taken away. What is quite sad to me is in a lot of countries, people don't even understand what is human trafficking. So they don't even recognize human trafficking, even if it happens under their noses.
Can you tell us a little bit more about how to identify these perpetrators of human trafficking?
The problem with human trafficking is that it can be linked to so many other crimes. Like, for example, people may be smuggled across the border. So many Africans want to go to Europe. And when they end up in Libya, instead of them getting smuggled across the sea to Europe, they are being sold as slaves, or they are being raped and they are being used in other factories, or they are sexually abused. So smuggling of migrants can turn into human trafficking. Human trafficking can turn into forced labor. And there's a variety of other things. It's like a spider's web. There are so many different people involved in human trafficking. It's not only the person who exploits the person, it's also the people who use the girl for sexual purposes. It's also the person who houses the girl. It's the person who recruits the child or the woman or the man. And all of these people can be found guilty of the crime of trafficking. So many people are involved in the whole trafficking ring. So it's very complicated.
What kind of interventions do you provide with regards to human trafficking?
Well, I've been quite fortunate to be involved with the United Nations Organization for Drugs and Crime, which is sort of the overall or overarching organization working in East Africa on training in human trafficking. We developed standard operational procedures for how the police and prosecutors could work together in investigating and prosecuting cases of trafficking in persons. What are the processes to refer this person to other organizations, for example, a shelter, or to go to a doctor or to a psychologist? And especially girls who were trafficked for sexual purposes, it might be a huge problem to get her back into her community because there might be a lot of shame. She might be shunned. So what do you do with that poor girl? So that's the kind of things that we're doing.
What strikes me about this conversation is that, much like many of the other issues that are prevalent within Africa, and our focus is on the challenges that we have within Africa due to the limited resources, the severity of the offences that we come across, and issues such as human trafficking, which you're speaking about, is that there doesn't seem to be much collaboration between countries, between departments within countries, between criminal justice systems, even within the same country.
If a woman was trafficked from, for example, Tanzania through Kenya to Uganda, and she was exploited in Uganda, how to get all these police agencies to work together? If they do not understand trafficking, how are they going to help the police agency in the next country to investigate the trafficking, to get all the elements of the trafficking? So in terms of mutual legal assistance, and that is still on a micro level. That is just with human trafficking. I'm not even talking about violence against women, where it's perpetrated by police officers or where they think it's a family issue. So there's a lot of complicated issues,
Whilst understanding that there are challenges even in the DNA infrastructures within various countries, having a database of sorts where you are able to identify either people that have been trafficked or perpetrators of the crime. Do you think this could work in Africa if one started talking about a humanitarian database specifically for human trafficking, where even if it started off very slowly, it could serve as an integrated approach towards these challenges of everybody working in separate pockets?
I definitely think so, to sort of embrace this idea of identifying people through DNA, because, that's one of the most amazing methods to identify people. As soon as a person is trafficked, their papers are taken away. So there's no real way to identify them. And I think their DNA would play a pivotal role. If you have a DNA sample of a person, then it would be much easier to identify that person.
That really strikes me as one of the fundamental issues here.
A good example is that when girls are being trafficked, they're being offered jobs in, for example, the Middle East, and it's very common that girls from East Africa go to the Middle East and they work as housemaids. But then what happens there? Their passports are taken away, so they don't have any identity. So if they start getting trafficked, that means if they are being abused, they're not paid, they are assaulted and whatever, they cannot leave. And even if they get killed, how the hell is anybody going to identify them? So I think in a situation like that, DNA would be a very good method to identify that.
Do investigators, which are performing undercover work, ever collect DNA evidence to obtain information from the victims or the perpetrators of trafficked persons?
I think, unfortunately, there's only a few countries that work with DNA. So that would really help if they have that tool in their arsenal.
Well, is it possible to describe a case where DNA was possibly used or could have been used successfully in human trafficking?
I was quite shocked. There was a case where young people with albinism was actually trafficked to Tanzania, and they were actually told that they were going on some kind of camp or something like that, and then they were killed for body parts. So I think that is already one of the very good examples of where DNA could have worked quite well.
Do you think the speed at which the DNA results can be obtained is important?
I think it is critical. Because the longer you take, the more difficult it becomes to either identify or to catch the perpetrators. They talk about the golden hour principle, where you have to act within the 48 hours after a crime has been committed. If it takes longer than that to identify, then the chances of ever finding a victim or catching a perpetrator just becomes less and less and less and less.
I certainly hope that DNA starts to become more accessible in some of these countries, because I feel as if it's the missing piece in the puzzle here. Is there any other helpline or organization that people can reach out to, either if they're a victim of human trafficking, if they want to get involved, or if they have any solutions or suggestions that they would like to put forward to help alleviate the situation?
I know that in, for example, Kenya, they actually developed a national referral system where they actually have a list of NGOs, NPOs, government organizations with telephone numbers, contact persons. They've also done the same, for example, in Uganda, which is quite incredible. Like, for example, this is the national referral system for Uganda, where they also have lists of organizations that are involved in the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime.
Pieter, this issue seems to be incredibly prevalent and very complex. And certainly the challenges that we experience in Africa seem to be more than other parts of the world. What would be your call to action for people watching and listening to this podcast as to how we can take this forward in a more positive way, in a more positive direction?
I think if people understand what is trafficking, they prepare themselves for it. So, for example, teach their children about it. If you teach the police about it, so knowledge is actually strength in this situation. So, if people are educated and they are warned, then I think that is quite quite important.
I think the work that you do is fascinating. It certainly is bringing knowledge that's needed into areas that have a problem with human trafficking. I certainly hope going forward that we see more collaboration between countries, between governments, between organizations. And if the one thing that DNA can do, you can never take away somebody's DNA. And that really is something that we need to hold on to in terms of hoping for the future, that despite papers being taken and forms of identity being taken away, DNA remains integral to any person, and that can never be taken away.